Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Dan Harada and Tim Langley, giving you a noontime briefing on what's going on in Japanese politics. I'd like to welcome Dan Harada of Nagatacho Forum. Hello, Dan.
Hello, nice to be back.
Nice to be back together again. There is so much going on in Japanese politics that we felt the audience deserved to have another update. Dan, it was 2 weeks ago when we gave our last noontime briefing, you might recall. And at that point in time, there were 9 candidates within the LDP vying for who was going to be president of the LDP, and thus, several days later, a vote for prime minister. That vote occurred about a week ago, and now we are in a completely new situation. Mr. Ishiba won that election over the Constitutional and Democratic Party, Mr. Noda, but the whole landscape of Japanese politics has changed as a result, Dan.
Yeah, now we have a minority government, which is the first time in more than 30 years. So that's the main change, and meaning that the ruling coalition, LDP Komeito, have to negotiate with the opposition more often than it had 2 weeks ago.
So I think most of the people who are in the audience are curious about what's the situation right now and what does it mean going forward. So there are a couple of complications that are going on, not the least of which being that there is a new president of the United States, President-elect Donald Trump. He will take office in January, but already he's starting to make a lot of policy decisions, a lot of pronouncements about what he's going to be doing. We haven't heard anything with regard to Japan, but we understand that is coming down the path. But more locally, and I think this election of the president of the LDP and thus the prime minister spells a lot of maybe confusion or delay, or it's just not going to be as smooth as it has been for, like you said, the last 30 years. There is a minority government here, and the prime minister needs to share his power with the opposition parties as well. Dan, Constitutional and Democratic Party, the Democratic Party for the People.
Yes, but the halfway in the lower house is 233, and the ruling coalition has 221. So it is a minority government, but it is not as critical as if there was a 60-seat difference from the halfway mark. So yes, coalition government, minority government, but it is not all that drastic.
Well, it depends on if you're Mr. Ishiba or not, I guess. The minority government, already we're seeing the repercussions of that. The first one being that since it is a minority government and the leading contender, Mr. Ishiba and his cabinet, need to share party power within the parliament. So of the committees within the Diet, and this is where policy is churned up and eventually surfaces to become a potential for becoming law, those committee chairs are not always controlled by, they have been, but they're not controlled now by the LDP. They have to share them, the committee chairmanships at least.
Well, there are 17 committees. The ruling coalition had all of them, 15 of them before, and now that has gone down to 12. And the most important thing is the budget committee. And the chair of the budget committee is not from the coalition, it is from the opposition. So the committee chair of the budget committee has the power to summon anybody to come to the committee and testify. And the one I have in mind is the prime minister. If he does summon the prime minister has to go.
So if you're familiar with what's going on inside the Diet and you watch it on TV from time to time, the largest committee room inside the lower house is the budget committee room. And it is representative of how much power it has. It is by far the most powerful committee within the parliament, and the chairman of that committee doesn't control everything, but the chairman does control the agenda and who might come up for testimony, including the prime minister. This is a concession that the Liberal Democratic Party had to give to the Constitutional Democratic Party, maybe for some concessions in other committee chairs, but this is a big one to give up, Dan, don't you think?
Well, it's a 50-person committee, which by far the largest of all of them, and the chairman has large powers, and I repeat, particularly the one to summon the prime minister, or anybody for that matter, to come and testify.
So the prime minister is, they finished their session yesterday. He is on his way to Peru, and from Peru to Brazil. In Peru, it's the ASEAN, where he's going to be meeting other heads of state, then on to Brazil, where the G20 meets. We don't know if his self-invitation to meet with President-elect Trump has been accepted, but the idea was that he would go from Peru to Brazil and maybe stop off in Florida before he came back to Japan. And then on the 28th of this month, they will start yet another diet session, Dan.
Yes, and this will be a so-called a regular session, as opposed to the one that ended yesterday. And the purpose of the session is to pass a supplementary budget. And it hasn't been decided. It'll start on the 28th. It hasn't been decided until when it will go on. But the purpose, supplementary budget.
Yeah. So not to get too much into the weeds, but I know people in the audience are very much into what's going on in Japanese politics. So we would be remiss if we didn't mention the recent activities of the Democratic Party for the People's leader, Mr. Tamaki, and his negotiations with the LDP and Komeito on how the LDP might cover that gap of 12 individuals so that the LDP, Komeito, and whoever else they can get eclipses the 50% mark. And obviously they weren't able to do that because they had to decide the committee chairs, and the LDP didn't sweep that, so they're still sharing that. The Constitutional Democratic Party received about 7 of those seats, is that right? And
yeah, the opposition has 7.
The opposition has 7. That means Ishin no Kai received 1 committee seat. The Democratic Party for the People received 1 seat, and then the Constitutional Democratic Party, which really gave the LDP a run for the money, has the remaining 4 seats.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So with the Democratic Party for the People, Mr. Tamaki, he was in tough negotiations with the LDP, and the LDP was proposing, I mean, they were having discussions with other opposition parties as well, but it seemed that the most fruitful one was going to be with the Democratic Party for the People. The negotiations were, we have the LDP and Komeito in a coalition government, but we don't have enough to have more than 50%. So we invite you to come into the coalition and vote with us on issues that are important to us, so that at least we can say we have a majority government. And Mr. Tamaki was playing very hardball, didn't receive any kind of firm commitment, and also didn't join the coalition. And this all came out kind of in the wash Monday and Tuesday, Dan.
Yes. Mr. Tamaki, sorry, will not formally join the coalition as a whole, which would actually mean getting a cabinet seat. On a shot-by-shot basis, on a specific legislation, he conceivably has agreed to vote with the coalition. On other issues, he hasn't said yes or no, but it is taken for granted it would be a shot-by-shot basis as opposed to a new partner in the coalition government.
So it's kind of like he retains a veto power among those issues that he really doesn't want to vote with the LDP Komeito coalition. He actually, according to the manifesto published by his party during the election, he has these issues that he's going to push forward and he's going to continue to negotiate. Whereas if he had agreed to the LDP Komeito proposal, maybe he would have gotten a cabinet seat. We don't know. There were a couple of cabinet seats that were vacant, in fact, and those have already been distributed. Komeito received one of them. The LDP took the other two, agriculture and transportation. And what was the third one? Transportation, justice. Justice was the third one. He could have gotten one of those, I guess, playing hardball, but he didn't. He wasn't able to get a concession there, and I guess that really upset a lot of people trying to form this coalition government to make things move smoothly. And what this spells is it's not going to be very smooth. And in fact, when the Diet comes back into session on the 28th, once the Prime Minister returns from Brazil and Peru and maybe the United States, another Diet session. Since the Budget Committee is now in the hands of the Constitutional Democratic Party, they, of course, want to talk about the supplemental budget, but there are other issues that maybe the chairman wants to really quiz the Prime Minister on, too.
Well, the chairman has all the power, and he may want to exercise it. And one of the areas where he may want to be a tough negotiator is on the scandal and the people who receive kickbacks. Some of the people who receive kickbacks have been summoned before a special committee to testify, but there are others who, for some reason, have not yet agreed to testify to that committee. And the chairman of the Budget Committee has the power to make them go and testify.
I recall, Dan, when Mr. Kishida was Prime Minister, he was hoping that this, with distributed retributions, with distributed punishments, and we're moving forward. This is all something of the past. Let's move forward. And that is not absolutely the case, is it?
It's not absolutely the case. And it's a weapon, it's a threat, which the chairman of the Budget Committee has in his hand.
So, Dan, in this election for Prime Minister, both houses, the upper house and the lower house, vote for Prime Minister. This happened on Monday. There was a lot of turmoil going on there. There was two votes. There was a vote for Prime Minister, and everybody, I mean, if the candidate wins 50%, then he becomes a Prime Minister. Every political party voted for their own man, as we somewhat predicted that they would do in the first round. And in the second round, the top two winners in the first round compete with each other, and whoever is the winner there becomes Prime Minister. There was a lot of turmoil going on there on Monday.
Yeah, there was. And if everybody in the opposition parties had agreed on one candidate, meaning Mr. Noda, well, Mr. Noda would have become Prime Minister. But at the end of the day, two of the opposition parties in the second round decided to vote for their own candidate in the first round, which means that their votes became void, and which is explained in a way explains why the current Prime Minister was re-elected.
That's right. So the denominator becomes smaller because a portion of the people who would vote, their votes were taken out because they were invalid. They snubbed their nose and they just voted for their own leader, knowing that it wasn't going to count. It wasn't going to count for Mr. Noda. It wasn't going to count for Mr. Ishiba. It just fell on deaf ears, and the Prime Minister was elected as a consequence of that. But the most important thing was, on the day of this vote, Mr. Tamaki was embarrassed widely by a scandal that was just reported in one of these pulp magazines called Flash. Dan, can you get into that?
Well, it's a little embarrassing, yes.
Sorry, it is a little bit
Yes.
embarrassing, but it's not reported in the English press. Nobody is really talking about it, but the impact of what happened and why it happened and how it happened, I think is really insightful on what's going on in Japanese politics. So that's why I'd like to explore it just a little bit with you, if you don't mind.
Well, within Jaminto, within the ruling party, which is 12 seats short of a majority, in Jaminto, there were some people who were lukewarm about making a deal with Mr. Tamaki. And when the news of the sexual escapade came up, the people who were lukewarm were more numerous. You don't particularly want to see yourself tied up with somebody who has a sexual scandal, which everybody is aware of. So that has something directly impacted on the negotiations between Jaminto and Mr. Tamaki.
Right.
And that is not yet completed.
Yes. So just to give people a little bit more detail, everybody I think is familiar with Bunshun. Bunshun is always digging up juicy tidbits on what's going on, picadillos with famous people, movie stars, actors, and politicians too. And it does have the ability to control the careers of many people in this town. And Flash is a competitor to Bunshun. It's kind of a men's magazine, I think you could say. It comes out pretty frequently, talking about social issues, talking about news and entertainment, sports, girls in bikinis, that sort of thing. And they came out with a story on Monday, I think it was Monday, Dan, that showed Mr. Tamaki leaving a hotel with a somewhat famous actress. I think she's an actress. Mr. Tamaki is married and happily married, apparently. And this came out, he's the leader of the Democratic Party for the People on the day that all of these machinations were going on inside the Diet. For him, it must have been just a punch in the face. I'm just curious about the timing of that and how that happened to embarrass him so widely at a time when he could have made a concession with the LDP and been in a coalition government, maybe had a cabinet seat. He gave that up. He stuck to his guns. He wants to have this swing vote, maybe even the veto power over some of these policy issues. He looks good for a while, but boy, he's been brought down a couple of ranks, hasn't he?
Well, the timing was as bad as it could have been for him. And it's not only the reaction of Jaminto people who don't want to be associated with sexual scandals or whatever you want, but it's also within his own party.
Right.
Okay? He's losing some glamour among his own fellow party members.
So we do have to point out, though, that during this election process, Dan, he was looking really good, wasn't he? He cut a very good figure. He's young. He had a nice suit on. He was always looking up. He had a very presidential kind of stature to him. And I think he had a great appeal to a lot of voters and a lot of people who were watching this drama unfold. That collapsed on Monday.
Well, I mentioned it the last time we met. If everybody in the opposition would have stuck together, he would be, and go for him, he would have been prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's a somewhat ridiculed leader of a small opposition parties. So there certainly was a turnaround within about a week.
It happened so quickly. So the LDP needs another 12 members to vote for it. It was thinking among the opposition parties, the Democratic Party for the People, their positions are not that widely divergent from the LDP's position. There are some positions on the constitutional changes, on the economy, on the tax tax regime, that sort of thing. But they are relatively close. And I think more than Ishin, that party appealed to the LDP, the people who needed to have those 12 seats. But I think with Mr. Tamaki playing hardball, the LDP just needs to come up with another 12 seats. Throughout the Diet, 700 people, there are members who would vote for an LDP covering that gap. It won't be a complete ruling government, but it is enough to eclipse the 50% mark to move policy forward.
Well, I completely agree. That's what I just said a few minutes ago. We are talking about 12 seats needed to get a majority.
Mm-hmm.
And in the so-called opposition, there are many people who do not belong to any party, who are just individuals, and you only need to bring 12 of those to dance with you.
Right. So let's talk about going forward. There will be another session of the Diet that starts on the 28th. We don't know how long that will be. It could be long, but we're moving into December too. December's the end of the year. The year closes out, and then there is a constitutionally mandated Diet session that starts in January, sometime in January. I don't think the starting date has been established. But for what's going on at the end of this month, it is mostly to establish a supplemental budget to defer the taxes, to reduce gasoline costs, to increase the standard of living of people, because they just went through an election. The Liberal Democratic Party, the Prime Minister, wants people to be rewarded for voting for the LDP when they did, and maybe the Constitutional Democratic Party wants to receive some benefit too. So they're going to come together to form a supplemental budget that will be a supplemental budget is actually injected into the economy rather quickly, isn't it, Dan?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that will take a very little time.
So how much turmoil do you think we're going to have in December? It'll be the 28th of this month, just a couple of days, and then we're in December. The session is not going to run that long unless, and this always happens in a new cabinet and a new administration, the prime minister selected the wrong minister of state. Stories come out. There could be a scandal there. Mr. Kishida was relatively fortunate in not having a lot of that happen in his first administration, but it does seem to pop up with regular frequency, Dan.
Well, it does, yeah. I know every time you have a new cabinet, there's always all the dirty magazines, the Flash, and so on, are looking for some dirt. But and one of the main reasons to have this special session, besides having the budget, is, as I said earlier, to try to clean the decks about the people who have received kickbacks.
Right.
So that will be the agenda starting on the 28th.
So since it's a minority government, any kind of wrench that's thrown into the spokes can really start to tumble out of control. The LDP had a big convention about this time last week in anticipation of the Diet session opening up. The prime minister had to listen to a lot of people complain about how he ran his campaign and why he became prime minister and his selection for parliamentary seats. But what is he going to be doing going forward? And I think the overall decision within the LDP was made, look, let's bring our forces together. Let's not have infighting. Let's move it forward until April 1st. Let's try and get the budget for 2026 passed, and then we can have a rethink about how appropriate is Mr. Ishiba as our prime minister. So between now and that point of time, would it be accurate to say that we're pretty much comfortable with Mr. Ishiba as the leader of the parliamentary process going forward for the next couple of months?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the Minto decided it was better not to wash the linen in front of everybody now. But as you've just said, Timothy, once next year's budget has cleared, so hopefully by the 1st of April, then it will be a new story. And if Mr. Sorry, if Mr. Ishiba is still around at that time, then it will become very dangerous for him.
Right. So
Until then, peace.
Yeah. So his approval rating actually took a blip up. When we last talked, his approval rating was maybe 30s, in the medium 30s, 35, 34, something like that. And today it is currently at around 43%. And I think that's probably a component of him being elected prime minister, opening the diet, and also being invited to Peru and to Brazil. We already knew that that was going to be happening. But, you know, when you have trouble at home, the best place to escape is into foreign affairs. And it looks like that always works.
Yes, and clearly. So, but anyway, he has to come back by the 28th. And as I repeat, it should be okay. Whether it is with Mr. Tamaki or without Mr. Tamaki, one way or the other, the gap is only 12 seats, and that can be filled by bringing up some unaffiliated opposition members.
Okay, so just to wrap this thing up, Dan, I think for the audience to understand better, probably if there's going to be fireworks, we're going to see it this month and into December. But as we go into a new diet session in January, probably until the budget is passed in April, there's a lot of infighting that's going on. But I think if there's going to be fireworks, it's probably going to be sooner rather than later. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
I mean, it is not in Giminto's interest to start fighting within home. Wait until the budget, next year's budget has passed, and then it's all loose.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. So for those in the audience that this is the sort of thing that you're really interested in, Dan Harada has a breakfast briefing once a month. You just hosted one yesterday, Dan, at the Capital Tokyo Hotel. If you're interested in and you are available in Tokyo to attend that briefing breakfast, write to Dan at Nakatacho Forum. Alternatively, Dan, Tim Langley and Maya Matsuoka have a briefing on Sunday mornings, every Sunday at 8:20, talking about the political happenings within that past week. So please tune into that. And for right now, I'd just like to wrap it up. Dan, you have any closing thoughts?
No, thank you for everybody for having listened. Talk to you soon.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. See you next time.
See you next time.